Graham Foster walked into the biggest cultural gala in Chicago with Lacey Monroe on his arm and left me at home with a black card, a cold text, and an assumption. He thought the room would turn for him the way rooms always had, but the talking stopped before he reached the center, and it did not stop for him. It stopped because I was standing at the top of the marble staircase in a dress the color of smoke after rain, and every face below had already tilted my way. I did not hurry, because rushing would have made it look like I was arriving into their world when the truth was that I had only returned to one. Silas Boone crossed the ballroom before Graham could even recover his smile, and when he reached me, he gave a small nod and murmured, "Cora Winslow," like a man confirming a fact, not greeting a stranger. 20 feet away, with Lacey's hand still looped through his sleeve, my husband finally understood the first part of his mistake, which was that powerful people already knew my name. The second part hit harder because it came from what I did not do, since I never looked at Lacey twice and never walked toward Graham at all. I took a champagne flute from a passing server, touched the elbow of a museum director I knew from a records access case, and kept moving while the room opened for me. By the time Graham turned fully to watch me speak to the one man he had spent months trying to impress, I was no longer the wife he had left home. And he knew it. At 6:47, Graham's text lit my kitchen counter with the same flat efficiency he brought to contracts. And I read, "Don't wait up. Business event. Use the card." I read it twice, not because I had missed the meaning, but because I wanted to be certain the thing rising in me was clarity, not heartbreak. The townhouse was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum behind me, and that small sound told me more truth than my husband had in months. I set the phone face down, picked it up again, and called June. Because there are moments when the body knows before pride admits anything has ended. She answered on the second ring, heard my breathing, and when I said, "I need the dress that stops a room," she did not waste one word. She only murmured, "Give me 40 minutes." And I hung up, knowing my sister understood the size of the night from the fact that I had finally asked. I went to the guest room closet, not the primary one Graham and I used in public language and separate instincts, and pulled down the pale storage box. Inside was the gown I had bought before I learned how expensive visibility could become. Midnight silk, sharp at the shoulders, cut for a woman who intended to be remembered. I held it against myself in the mirror, and the woman looking back at me was not fragile or forgotten, only practiced at becoming smaller than the truth. 3 years earlier, after the threats and the leaks and the strangers deciding my life was public property, disappearing had felt less like surrender than discipline. Then discipline became habit, and habit became marriage. And marriage became a room where a man could text me a card instead of a place at his side. By the time June arrived downstairs, keys in hand and purpose already moving ahead of her, I was dressed, zipped, and finished apologizing for taking up space. Graham always liked arriving late enough to bend a room around him, and that night he came through the ballroom doors with Lacey Monroe hanging close, polished and perfectly briefed. He wore the expression he saved for donors and board members, the one that suggested access was a privilege, while she carried herself like a woman already rehearsing life inside someone else's spotlight. I watched them from halfway across the floor and knew before either of them looked up that only one of us understood what kind of room this really was. I moved through the crowd without hurrying, because speed would have made me look uncertain, and uncertainty was the one thing I had not brought with me that night. A man from the Field Museum touched my arm and smiled. "Cora, we're still using your archive framework in the South Side Restoration Project." And I answered warmly, let the sentence land, then kept walking. Lacey heard him. I know she did, because her posture shifted a fraction too late, the way it does when a woman realizes the script in her head no longer matches the air around her. Near the auction tables, a trustee from the Illinois Humanities Council lifted her glass toward me and said, "Your testimony last spring saved that records access bill." And Graham's face changed before he could stop it. He had never asked enough questions to know where I spent my time. So now every greeting sounded to him like a revelation, and every revelation came with witnesses. Lacey stayed on his arm, but the grip had changed. Less possession now than balance. And that was the first honest thing she had done all evening. I passed within 6 feet of them and gave neither of them the relief of a confrontation. Because some humiliations deepen when they are denied a stage. Lacey tried to hold my eyes, perhaps hoping for recognition, perhaps hoping for rank. But I took a champagne flute from a server and turned instead toward the director of a literacy initiative I had funded quietly for 2 years. "You vanished on us," she laughed softly, and I let myself smile for the first time that night, because disappearing had once protected me, but now it was only making other people comfortable. By the time Silas Boone crossed the room and asked if we might speak privately, the damage had already settled into Graham's face with cold, mathematical precision. He looked from Boone to me, then to Lacey, and I could almost hear him recalculating the whole evening. The donor strategy, the entrance, the woman beside him, the woman he had left behind. Lacey understood it 1 second after he did. And in that second, she stopped looking like a chosen woman and started looking exactly like what she was. Someone standing in a place she had mistaken for hers. I had known about the affair for weeks before the gala, not because Graham confessed or because Lacey slipped, but because careless people always leave patterns before they leave apologies. The first pattern was an email Aaron Wallace flagged after comparing forwarded calendar holds, where a donor breakfast request described me as private by preference in language I had never used. The second was a mood board Lacey sent from Graham's office account. Built around phrases lifted almost cleanly from a restricted proposal, my foundation had circulated to 3 vetted partners. Once I saw those 2 things side by side, the rest stopped looking like betrayal and started reading like project management with lipstick over it. There were car charges, styling invoices, and guest transport receipts billed against a household card, then disguised later as hospitality costs tied to Northline development meetings. Erin spread the records across her conference table, tapped one line item after another, and murmured, "This is not an affair improvising itself. Cora, this is a rollout." That was when I understood. Lacey was never the woman he happened to choose after me, because she had been helping him draft the version where I disappeared gracefully. They were building language for donors before they built honesty for me, shaping a clean little public story where I disliked attention, preferred private life, and had quietly stepped aside. Every draft made the same wager, that I would keep doing what I had done for 3 years already. Stay silent long enough for silence to be mistaken for consent. They had even started borrowing my reputation without the labor of knowing me, sliding suggestive phrases into pitch materials about trusted civic access and long-standing philanthropic relationships. Graham could not have opened those rooms alone, and Lacey could not have photographed her way into them alone. So together they used the outline of me. By the time I walked into the gala, I was not arriving to discover what they had done. I was arriving after reading the whole shape of it. I found Graham on the east balcony with the city lights behind him and the ballroom sealed off by glass, which finally made him look like a man instead of a performance. He turned as I stepped beside the railing and let out, "What are you doing here?" Not angry yet, only off balance, because confusion always reached him before shame. I rested one hand on the stone ledge and answered, "I didn't come for you, Graham. I came because this room was never yours to keep me out of." He stared at me like a man reading a map too late, then asked, "Then why tonight?" And that question exposed him more cleanly than any apology could have. Even now, he thought timing had to orbit him, as if my life could only move in reaction to his choices. I looked through the glass toward Silas Boone and said, "Because tonight was the night you finally used my silence like it belonged to you." His face tightened, but what unsettled him was not anger, because anger he knew how to manage, and scenes he knew how to survive. What he had never learned to handle was precision, especially from a woman he had trained himself not to see. "You spoke with Boone," he said quietly, and I let the sentence sit there before answering. I did, because I recognized his acquisition structure months ago. That landed hard enough to make him forget Lacey, the ballroom, and every polished line he had walked in carrying. "You knew someone was coming after Northline and said nothing," he asked, and I answered. I knew, and I handled it, which is not the same thing. Then I gave him the piece that mattered most. Tonight I offered Silas Boone one choice: withdraw cleanly before the disclosures move further, or keep pushing and let the structure become visible. He took one step closer then, lowering his voice the way men do when they feel power sliding away from them in real time. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, and I looked at him long enough to make him hear the whole answer before I spoke it. "Because you sent me a card instead of a place, brought Lacey Monroe instead of honesty, and used the outline of my name to start writing me out of my own life." He opened his mouth, maybe for defense, maybe for regret, but neither mattered anymore because both had arrived too late to alter the record. "I am not here to win you back from her," I told him, and that was the first moment he understood this was never about another woman. "I am here to end your right to use my silence, my reputation, and my absence as raw material for a future that does not include me." We did not leave together in any sentimental sense after the balcony, but we stepped out of the gala on the same timeline because some endings require witnesses. The car door closed behind us. The city slid past in black glass and streetlight, and Graham sat across from me with the stunned stillness of a man who had finally run out of assumptions. I reached into my bag, took out the bound packet Aaron Wallace had prepared that afternoon, and placed it on the seat between us before either of us spoke again. He looked down first at the tabbed pages, then at me, and I watched recognition arrive in layers as he saw legal paper instead of emotion. "What is this?" he asked, quieter now, and I answered. "A divorce filing ready to be submitted, a litigation hold, and formal notice terminating any use of my name, my foundation, or non-public materials." His hand did not touch the packet immediately, which told me more than panic would have, because Graham only hesitated when he understood something had already been completed without him. Outside the window, Chicago kept moving with the indifferent grace of a city that had seen cleaner men than mine come apart in smaller cars. Inside that silence, I watched his eyes move over the headings Aaron had chosen with surgical restraint. Preservation of communications, preservation of shared files, preservation of billing records, preservation of device data. "You prepared all this before tonight," he said, and I held his gaze long enough for the truth to settle before I answered. "I prepared it when I realized you were not just betraying me. You were building process around it." He opened to the second section then, saw Lacey Monroe's name, saw the language restricting future use of my identity in donor contact or project materials, and finally exhaled. "Cora," he started, but there was nothing useful after my name, because explanation only works before the paperwork reaches your lap. I folded my hands and gave him the only mercy left in the car, which was clarity, then said, "I do not need a scene. Graham, I need a clean record, preserved evidence, and a future no one drafts in my absence." He sat back with the packet still open, and for the first time in 3 years, the space between us felt honest because it was finally structured by truth. I had once mistaken invisibility for safety, but a man who treats your silence like usable property will keep billing against it until you revoke access. By the time the car turned onto our block, the marriage was no longer a question waiting for feelings. It was a file waiting for signatures. The fallout began on Monday morning, which felt right to me, because damage built on polished lies rarely explodes on impact and almost always arrives when offices open. Northline Features received 2 calls before noon from donors who had seen enough at the gala to start asking the precise questions Graham had hoped nobody would ever ask. By 1 o'clock, a board advisor had requested written clarification on donor access language in his recent materials, and the request alone stripped all charm from his version of events. He did not call me to rage, which told me more than shouting would have, because men like Graham only go quiet when they understand the problem is now bigger than persuasion. Aaron Wallace forwarded me the formal notice from his counsel acknowledging preservation obligations, which meant the devices, files, receipts, and message chains were no longer private habits but discoverable history. The next donor breakfast on his calendar disappeared by late afternoon. Then another vanished before dinner. And each cancellation said the same thing without ever needing to say it aloud. Lacey Monroe lost her footing faster, because her power depended on movement, on being invited in, on getting one more room before the last one compared notes. A national fashion campaign she had been circling went cold after its creative director learned her name had surfaced inside a live legal hold tied to misrepresented access. She posted twice that week, too brightly, too carefully, and the brightness itself gave away the truth that she was already outside the doors she thought she had entered. Silas Boone retreated the way old predators do when they recognize another hunter has already marked the ground more cleanly than they expected. The acquisition pressure on Northline stopped. The shell path went quiet, and the intermediaries who had been so eager suddenly became difficult to locate. He never apologized, and I never required one, because the withdrawal itself was the only language men like Silas Boone respect when it costs them speed. June Hollis came by with coffee on Wednesday and looked at me over the kitchen counter, as if checking whether I had finally returned to my own body. I had, and she knew it before I answered, because I was standing differently, not taller for effect, just no longer braced for disappearance. She touched the rim of my mug and murmured, "There you are," and it landed harder than any speech could have because my sister had watched me get smaller in real time. By the end of the week, Aaron had the filing sequence ready, the evidence chain clean, and every relevant use of my name fenced off by written notice. Graham Foster still had his company. Lacey Monroe still had her face. Silas Boone still had his money. But none of them kept the thing they had reached for through me. I kept mine, which was the point, because consequence does not always mean ruin. Sometimes it means everyone is forced to live without access to what they treated like it would stay unguarded forever. 3 months later, I stood inside a smaller fundraiser with my own name on the program, my own work on the walls, and no need to be translated through anyone else. The room was quieter than the gala. Warmer, too, filled with teachers, archivists, neighborhood directors, and people who cared more about what survived than who got photographed beside it. A reporter near the exit asked why I had chosen to step back into public life after so long, and I told her, I did not come back to be seen. I came back because I am done disappearing for other people's comfort. When the night ended, I walked out alone beneath the Chicago lights, but nothing in me felt abandoned, which was how I knew the healing had finally become real. Graham was gone. Lacey was gone. The marriage was gone. Yet the life they had tried to build by reducing me had failed for the simplest reason possible. I no longer needed to be chosen back into a story that had shrunk me, because this time I had stayed with myself, and that was the part nobody could take. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the parts that heal quietly after everything breaks. If any piece of it felt like your own life, I hope you choose yourself sooner than I did. Stay close, and I will meet you in the next story.